Today, I'm in Dublin and I'm super excited to be speaking to Senan Moloney. He's the global head of cyber fraud fusion at Barclays. With his decades of experience in law enforcement and finance, he's built a fusion center of over 50 people. This is a new episode of Fusion Fireside. Slantje. So Senan, so you started out, where did you start out? Because everybody thinks you started out in law enforcement, but you started out somewhere else, really?
Yes, I did. I started out as an electronic and computer engineer. So yeah, my background is engineering. I studied electronic and computer engineering. That was my degree qualification in university. And then I actually followed that up with a master's in optoelectronic engineering. So I went very, very technical for a number of years. So my first couple of jobs out of university, the first one was I was working with a small startup company that were designing a new type of laser device for optical telecommunications. And then I moved from that to work for a big US electronics company who made, at the time, they made the connectors for a lot of the big mobile phone manufacturers. So like Nokia, Motorola. So yeah, I often tell people that I designed the game Snake, but I didn't. But I did work on some of the hardware, the electronics inside a lot of the kind of Nokia and Motorola phones at the time. So that's how I actually started out in life. That was my original career. And then from there, I one day randomly saw an advert for a new analytical service that the Irish police were setting up. So they were looking for graduates from a variety of disciplines with somewhat of a technical background to join a new core team that would do in-depth analysis of crime trends, hotspots, so on and so forth. Threw an application in for that. Didn't really think a lot of it at the time. Long story short, got called for interview, got called for another interview, and got the job. So that's how I actually ended up in law enforcement.
So, and that was in a time before that really the digital police was really a thing, right?
100%. So I think at that point in time, I think the Garda, National Police Force in Ireland, they had a cybercrime unit, but it was very, very small and it was in its infancy. And digital, policing, as you say, was really only starting out because this is, I guess, before really the advent of the smartphone, right? So almost all crime or all investigation of crime rather nowadays needs some forensic analysis of, devices. Back then that wasn't necessarily the case. But yeah, so when I got into that role, I obviously brought with me my background in computing and electronics. So I started to kind of veer towards some of the analysis of mobile phone devices, etc. Back then it was more cell site analysis linked to, different types of crime. But then I became more and more kind of interested in that aspect of it. So I decided to do a little bit more study. So I took on a second master's to specifically qualify in forensic computing and cybercrime investigation.
Yeah, that's amazing. I remember those days. It's like before cyber was really a word.
It wasn't a thing. You're right.
It was forensics, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I thought the founders of Fox IT started out as forensics guys as well.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Cyber wasn't really a word in the public parlance, nor was it a sector.
Yeah.
It wasn't, which is crazy to think as we sit here now, whatever number of years on, the cybersecurity industry, it's huge, right?
Yeah. Well, at least you studied something that was, similar to what you're doing right now. It's like for all of us older geezers, there wasn't even anything to study. It was just the guy that knew about computers. Well, you do you do the IT stuff, Yeah.
That was how it went. That's true. That's really true.
Yeah. When you went ahead and started working for the police, what happened then?
So I was working for the Irish Police, like I say, for a number of years, then did that qualification specifically in cybercrime investigation and forensic computing. And then I started to maybe look a little bit broader than Ireland to see what other potential roles were out there. And I applied for a job as an intelligence analyst in Europol. And back to the point you made about, cyber not really being, an industry thing at the time. This was before Europol had founded the European Cybercrime Centre. So I applied for that role. Again, was lucky to get the position, moved to Europol to become an intelligence analyst. And because of my background and my qualifications, I was put into a team called Focal Point Cyborg. Cyborg standing for Cyber Criminal Organizations. Roll on another probably 12 months or so, and the European Cybercrime Centre was formally founded within Europol, and the Cyborg team was naturally, a core operational component of that. So I then spent 4 to 5 years in Europol, where my focus was investigating cyber criminal organizations. Not solely, obviously, on my own, but with the help of a lot of other really, really clever analysts and specialists. But also, I think the most remarkable thing about that job was the level of international collaboration, to get to the end result in, attribution of these criminal groups.
So can you talk a little bit about which countries you think in those days at least were let's say more ahead of the curve with regards to law enforcement in cybercrime?
Not just because you're here, but I would have to say the Netherlands were always very, very progressive in terms of, one, their outlook in terms of where they needed to be at a skills level, two, how they set themselves up in terms of bringing, skills from the private sector into the police force, etc. Obviously, as you know, there's a lot of internet infrastructure hosted in the Netherlands. So it was always quite a hotspot internationally in terms of geographic terms. It was always a hotspot in terms of finding criminal infrastructure potentially hosted in the Netherlands. So I would say the Dutch were, obviously up there. In addition to that, in terms of those who were on the forefront of pushing international investigations, the FBI, obviously the US agencies, NCA from the UK, were always present as well when it came to those bigger types of investigations.
Oh.
Yeah.
And probably most of the work that you did, you can never talk about, but some of the work, of course, suddenly gets public. Yeah. And that's, of course, when it gets interesting. So are there some cases you remember you can talk about which really made an impression of you?
So there's multiple, I think, actually at the time when we were working there, it wasn't as big a thing to do the big publication, the big media reveal. I think Europol has got really good at that in recent years in terms of sending that, hard message to cyber criminals and organized cyber criminal groups. But, at the time we worked mainly on banking Trojan malware cases. So this is back in the day where, Drydex and Dyer were rife and, were targeting, banks all across Europe and banks in the US. And then some other organized cyber criminal groups who were involved in the laundering of the funds associated with those campaigns. So I think, the best way to describe the job really was, it led to zoning in on specific individuals or groups, but it really was mapping an understanding of the crime as a service underground economy. And from there, picking out, what core services, were really instrumental or crucial for multiple different groups, and then targeting those. So that kind of level of international disruption. So I guess the biggest bang for your buck. So if we take out this little group or we take out this service, is going to have a bigger knock-on impact on multiple different groups that, are using it.
Right. And I remember at least some cases where, Europol with partners was able to at least disrupt the scene for quite a bit every now and then. Yeah. Is disruption the best law enforcement can do?
I think so. So, I think one of the things I've observed over the years, and I think this isn't just me saying this, I think most people that have been involved in investigating cybercrime or working in this field realize that you can't really arrest your way out of cybercrime, in the traditional sense that law enforcement, investigate other more traditional types of crime. There's a victim, there's a perpetrator, there's an arrest, etc. But the scale and pace at which cybercrime moves, means that you can never arrest every single individual, not let alone enumerate all of the victims. So the only way to really go about it is to disrupt the actual services themselves. So for me, absolutely, I think upstream disruption is the only real way, and it's still a game of, cat and mouse, really. Like, you'll appreciate that in terms of, you've been in that world as well, where, you take down one service and then it has huge disruption impact for a period of time. And then the criminals, as they often do, regroup and, mobilize another service, and their OPSEC increases and they put it behind, a more difficult door to knock down, etc. But yeah, like, back to your question, 100%, disruption of the crime as a service ecosystem, I think, has been the model in international policing against cybercrime for quite some time, with a lot of impact as well.
Yeah, I agree. You talked about Dyer and Drydex those days. They were, I remember them, if I'm correct, them actually starting out because another group, Game Over Jesus, was disrupted by law enforcement. And after it was, quiet for a few months, they started up operations, they split up. It's like a tapeworm. If you cut a tapeworm in two, now you have two tapeworms. It's
exactly, and even like the communication channels that these groups leverage. So back at the time, a lot of it was on Jabber servers, and then because they found out through some of those big international investigations that Jabber server communication wasn't as infallible as they thought it was, they slowly over time moved away from Jabber and moved on to, current day channels like Telegram and all the rest of it, So it's disruption, but it's also displacement to a certain degree, I guess. And then you have to follow where they're going next.
Right, the bulge in the carpet, if you press it down, it will pop up somewhere else. Yeah. Well, that might bring us to the next interesting point is threat intelligence is, of course, one of the ways to track that stuff. And, you've made the transition from law enforcement to banking. So how did that happen?
So that's a great question. So after a number of years in Europol, I think it just was an opportunity that, came to me from, my manager at the time, transparently in Europol, who moved across to Barclays. And I think back at that time, the banking industry, not that the banking industry was waking up to cyber, but was waking up to maybe, building new transformation programs within their organizations to deal with cyber risk in a more intelligence-driven way. So at the time, Barclays was setting up a cyber threat intelligence function, and the opportunity was there to come across and be, one of the first individuals to help build that out. So that really was how it happened. And I've always been one, I think, not to say it was a risk, but I think one of the things that has always been in my mind is that you need to see the problem space from multiple different angles. So as, amazing a role I had in Europol, and you get that perspective of the global transnational angle to cybercrime, you're still seeing it from the point at which it's reported and being investigated. You're not really seeing it at the cusp of the speed at which it's happening. So that was one of the incentives to move to, a large global bank, to really understand the scale and pace of cybercrime. And I think that was the big thing that took me aback when I moved across, is like, it's like the amount of attempted attacks on a daily basis and the amount of cybercrime that, will never, ever really get reported. Or if it is reported, it will take quite some time for it to get to a national law enforcement agency. And then where we were in Europol, you need essentially multiple national law enforcement agencies reporting a crime that has a common nexus. And at that point, it gets taken on as, an international investigation. But there's a huge, huge percentage of cybercrime that will never get to that level.
Yeah.
So yeah, moved to Barclays, was part of that initial team that was involved in building out a cyber threat intelligence function. And I think, again, to the point we made about how quickly industry moves over time, I think it's the standard norm at this stage to have, an intelligence-driven defense framework where cyber threat intelligence is kind of the tip of the spear in understanding where adversaries are moving in terms of their MOs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then really importantly, how your controls stack up against that.
Yeah. So you described yourself the other day to me as a cyber guy moved into the fraud space.
Yeah, that's probably fair. So again, I took another leap. I think, obviously, like this is quite a philosophical debate in some ways, right? So as much as the cyber industry was set up for me at the time where the internet became a thing, right? So if I asked you the question, what's the meaning of the word cyber? What would you say?
Yeah, that's a very well. I would say pretty much anything with bits and bytes that is touching the process.
Well, it's like, in the truest sense of the term, cyber means anything to do with computers or computer networks.
Well, there you go.
And the biggest computer network that we have is the internet, right? So that's what cyber is. But we've now moved to a point in time where everything we do in our ordinary lives is cyber.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't call it that.
Cyber citizens.
Yeah. But like fraud is no different insofar as, as we talked about in terms of how criminals adapt over time, they leverage all of the tools available to them, but they also move with where people move. So, everybody transacts, makes payments, does their shopping online or on mobile. So it just stands to reason that that's where criminals then follow, right? So a lot of fraud nowadays, there's a cyber facilitator or enabler, but it's almost got to the point where, and this is weird for me to say coming from a cyber background, but the word cyber is almost redundant. It's almost moot because, it's technology enabled. It's technology facilitated.
Right.
So, when you do your shopping, you don't say, I was doing some cyber shopping.
Yeah.
When you book your travel, I was doing some cyber travel booking. You just do it because that's the quickest way to do it nowadays. So I guess one of the things that we were looking at internally in Barclays was, we were sending a lot of threat intelligence to fraud teams, etc. And transparently ourselves, it was like, I felt there was a need to maybe map the end-to-end ecosystem a little bit more to, for our teams to understand the fraud world, for the fraud world to better understand what's happening in the cyber world. And then, on from that to understand how criminals move money in the back end, which moves into what would be traditionally seen as a financial crime or AML world. Yeah. So we started to adapt a lot of the principles and methodologies that are used in the cyberspace to map out how fraud happens end to end. So from that very first technology or cyber enabler right through to how the individual is targeted with a fraud or scam attack, on to how the money is moved on the back end. And that really was, I think, the starting point for us building out what we now call Cyber Fraud Fusion.
That's interesting because I know many in our field think that from threat intelligence to detection to fraud engines to money laundering, crossing those bridges they're such siloed organizations, you're bound to run into trouble. Is that your experience as well?
I think trouble is probably the wrong word. I think there's a learning curve, right, in terms of, they're established sectors and domains that, as you've spoken about, fraud has existed since time immemorial. Fraud isn't a new thing. Money laundering isn't a new thing. Cyber is newer, but the leveraging of cyber and, advanced technologies to facilitate fraud and money laundering is moving at a pace that probably fraud or money laundering didn't move at before. So I think, there's a learning curve in terms of how you connect those different areas in such a way that you build the end-to-end picture and then can look to maybe controls that, are maybe upstream of what traditionally would have been considered in the fraud or financial crime world. And I think that's where it gets really powerful, where everybody starts to look at the picture from that end-to-end perspective, as opposed to, looking at the exact, finite A to B fraud component of it, or the actual money laundering component. I think the more you know about what happened before, the better you can sit back and say, okay, well, could we have stopped it before it even happened? Or back to what we spoke about previously in terms of disruption, should we be collaborating with somebody or discussing with somebody outside of the bank, whether it's law enforcement, intelligence, with telcos, with tech, to really bring this problem to a different, solution than the traditional solution, which is try to stop the money moving at the point that payment is attempted.
Right. And you must be doing something right, because right now you're the global head of Cyber Fraud Fusion at Barclays, and you have some more accolades, I think.
I'm not sure about accolades, but yes, that's the title at present. So, I must say that we've had a lot of backing in terms of the proposal to build out the Fusion Center, and we've had great collaboration internally in the organization as well with our colleagues in the fraud teams and financial crime teams. So, we use the Fusion Center term in two ways. So there's the Cyber Fraud Fusion Center from the perspective of the team that I'm lucky enough to lead and manage. But then there's the Fusion Center in terms of the collaborative meaning of the term. So, many times when we are zoning in on maybe an emerging fraud threat that we believe, we need to double down on as an organization to see, how robust we are or how we can better protect clients and customers. That takes multiple people from multiple teams across the organization coming together under that Fusion umbrella. And that's the thing that is really motivating for me. It's seeing the organization do that at pace and at scale, and seeing how much my team can learn from other teams in the organization and vice versa. And it's sometimes the unintended consequences or wins on the back of collaboration that are really inspiring, as opposed to maybe what you expected the result to be.
Right, and that includes collaboration outside of your organization. So it's not just the 50-something people in your department that are working on this, but it's also to do with other banks, with the communities, with law enforcement, with big tech.
All of that. And obviously that comes with limitations in terms of how much we can share, adhering to, all, appropriate data privacy regulation and compliance demands upon us, etc. But I'm a big advocate for sharing across industry and bringing insight to others to allow them to better understand how they can maybe, protect their organization or their clients or customers. But also, when it comes to big tech and telco in particular, I think there's a huge amount of really, exciting developments in terms of the collaboration that now exists in, those entities and those sectors, doing more to disrupt fraud. But the attack chain model that we haven't really spoke about yet, but that, I described it as that end-to-end picture of what's happening from cyber technology enabler to fraud to financial crime. What we found is when we bring that picture to industry, it actually sometimes is quite eye-opening for them in terms of, okay, we didn't maybe fully appreciate or understand how much our legitimate services or products were being misused or abused by criminals to facilitate fraud downstream, because they don't see the fraud, right? So huge advocate for, sharing not just intelligence at an industry level, but talking strategically at an industry level in terms of, what different sectors can do together to, again, as we spoke about, disrupt earlier,
right. And how important is such a thing as a common vocabulary and a common attack chain in sharing in the industry?
Well, that's hugely important. And I guess that brings us on to, a topic that, we've been quite passionate about in terms of moving industry towards that common language. So one of the lessons learned, I think, internally, even in the build out of our Fusion Center, is that, through no fault of anybody's, I think if you come from a cyber background, you speak a slightly different language to somebody that, comes from a fraud background or an AML background. And sometimes we're talking about the same things, but we use completely different terms, So, when we're talking about like TTPs and IOCs and left of kill chain and upstream disruption, that's not part of the normal lexicon in the fraud space. But then equally, when, fraud experts are talking about like, TDV and genuine decline rates and, customer journeys, they're not terms that are in the, normal parlance of like traditional cyber folk. So I think in bringing that together, there's a need to come to a taxonomy that explains the end-to-end attack flow from cradle to grave in a way that probably isn't there at industry yet, I would say. You have a cyber background as well, so you're familiar with obviously the Lockheed Martin kill chain, the MITRE attack framework, but the cyber industry didn't always have them either. It took a number of years for industry to align to one or two of those frameworks, and then everybody to begin to kind of share against them. And that's what I would love to see happening, in the fraud space, really, that we move towards that. So we have an attack chain model, a cyber fraud attack chain that we use internally in Barclays. I think one of the really motivating things for me is that, I've presented this at international conferences, I think, for the last 3 or 4 years now. And I remember the first year I presented it, I could almost see some of the eyes looking back up at me in the room, and this was to a fraud audience, and they were like, not that they weren't engaged, but I could tell that this was like a leap too far maybe at that point in time. But like iteratively, like year on year, I see more institutions adopting similar kind of frameworks. And now there's also a number of industry initiatives looking at this as well. So there's different organizations at an industry level looking at what they call, cyber fraud prevention frameworks. Some people are calling, their models kill chains, others are using attack chain. But it's almost like the industry is like, storming and forming, so to speak, in terms of aligning on something. So I think we're at like, we're at a point where people are waking up to the need for this, and not just from an intelligence sharing perspective. So I think having a framework like that is very powerful in terms of allowing you to share like for like in terms of a piece of intelligence and understanding where that intelligence fits into an economic crime attack, right? But what would be really even more powerful is if you then move to mapping the potential controls that are available to you to stop the attack at that point in time, right? And I think that's what really excites me in terms of the industry aligning towards one taxonomy to kind of manage industry intel sharing and control mapping at scale.
So now you've been building these from scratch, right, at Barclays. So what would you say to people maybe listening to you right now that are sitting in organizations having similar responsibilities but still feel like the walls of the silo pressing in on them? What would be for them would be the first steps to take? How do they start?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, we kind of, I guess, went with the build it and they will come approach to a certain degree, in that I think it's maybe a little bit easier now because, nobody really does have to start completely from scratch now because those industry initiatives are out there, right? So people can leverage some of those models or look to what other organizations are doing. So we have some really good examples in the UK where, we have got the Cyber Defence Alliance, for example, that has a fraud attack chain methodology. So organizations can look to those and start to, map their own fraud attacks against them. I think, obviously, it's hard to give advice to other organizations when you don't understand their internal constructs, how they're structured, etc. But irrespective of that, I think one of the big things is reaching out, across the table or to the other departments and getting to that, common goal, right? So I think getting that understanding from teams that actually this is something that we're designing to help you, but we need your help in the design of it as well. So like if I break down the attack chain concept in its simplest terms, it's like whatever number of phases you come up with in your attack chain to map your economic crime attacks, you will need to ask 3 or 4 very simple questions at each stage of the attack chain. So one would be, what, if any, visibility can I get on that stage of the attack, right? 2 would be, if there is some visibility that I can acquire, is there data associated with that, and can I acquire that data? And then number 3 would be, is there any way to use or turn that data into some sort of control, right? Now, those are very, very simple questions, but to get the answers to those questions as you move down the attack chain, you need to call on multiple different teams, within the organization. Some of the questions in terms of, some of the answers in terms of those questions at the left of the attack chain, where it's more around how cyber criminals are building their infrastructure, how they're directly targeting customers, etc. The answers are maybe in the traditional cyberspace within an organization. But as you move further down in terms of how customers are being directly targeted, contacted, that type of information or intelligence might come from your fraud operations department, who are, dealing with customers, calling them all the time. When it comes to how the actual fraudulent payments were attempted and how they're, being, maneuvered to circumvent fraud rules, then you need to bring in your fraud analytics teams, because, they're the ones that have the expertise in managing, the fraud engines, right? And then, as you move further down, the answers to the questions in terms of how the money was moved on sometimes require you to contact your financial crime team. So I guess, that's the journey, right? But you can't start on the journey without really explaining the concept day one. So it's getting that, I think, buy-in from different teams. And we started really small. So we set up a Fusion Center by putting 2 fraud analysts, 2 financial crime analysts, and 2 of my CTI analysts in a room together. And it just grew naturally. There were opportunities in looking at different data sets in a way that none of them had ever thought to explore before, that led us to, some quick wins. And it grew from there. So start small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's great advice. Yeah. One thing I always like to ask my guests, and especially you, since you spent the larger part of your life dealing with crime from different perspectives, whether it be from law enforcement, whether it be from the banks and from the victim side. What do you think is going to happen next? Do you have a prediction? Do you have a direction where you see the criminals moving? What might be the next thing for the industry to prepare itself against?
So there's an obvious answer to that, and I think it is probably the true answer, which is, the AI answer, right? So, the history of cybercrime, and at least from my perspective, in the length of time that I've been working on it, has been, it's almost an arms race. It's a game of cat and mouse to leverage the latest technologies that are out there, right? And if I was to maybe summarize at a really high level, and this might be overly simplistic, but how I've seen cybercrime change over the last 10 or 12 years, right? One would be the scale and pace of it. It's like nothing we've ever seen, year on year, for all the amazing, international and industry level wins. The figures that we get presented with in terms of what is lost to either ransomware attacks or business email compromise attacks, or they're conservative estimates, but they're growing and growing. So you'll appreciate this. We've moved from, annual reports that were millions, billions, trillions. So the scale and pace is number one. I think the second thing is, and these all go hand in hand, is the lowering of the barrier to entry to become a cyber criminal. So when we go back to, those days where, we were looking at, in the main, not to generalize, Russian organized cyber criminal groups that were behind a lot of the banking Trojan malwares, there was quite a level of sophistication to how they operated. Now the crime as a service ecosystem is almost like service delivery, where each service that is being sold comes with, deals in terms of, if it doesn't work, you get your money back guarantee. There's always on-call support, etc. So, as I always say to people when I'm presenting, you really don't need to have any background in technology or computers anymore to be a cyber criminal, right? And then the third thing would be, and I'm getting back to your question, right? But the third thing then in terms of the big change, and this one is really interesting, is I think there's been quite a pivot in terms of targeting, particularly on the cyber fraud side. As in, once upon a time, it was targeting of technology or a system to take over the accounts and move the money. Now it's targeting of the individual. And a lot of it over the last few years has obviously been in the scam space, and the majority of that comes with impersonation. So cyber fraud has almost become the imitation game, to use that phrase, right? But the big horizon threat with that is obviously AI, and in particular Gen AI, because that allows impersonation on a whole new horizon. So if you take, your traditional education and awareness to colleagues or to customers in terms of how to spot, a phishing email, right? You get them to use critical thinking around what they're reading. But now we're moving to a world where you need critical thinking around what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And we're already seeing in the cybercriminal underground advertisements for Gen AI, voice clones, deepfakes, all the rest of it. So it's not so much a horizon threat, it's here already. Right. And I think one of the things that scares me slightly with it is the scale and pace at which AI is moving, right? So I talked about it being like a bit of an arms race to leverage the latest technology for bad on a cybercriminal side, for good, on the defense side. But my worry is that because we have to adhere to all of those, big words like compliance, regulation, data privacy, etc., and criminals don't, that they're going to be moving really, really fast with how they're leveraging AI. So, we've seen, a lot of us have seen the big reports in the media about some global companies that have lost millions to deepfake scams already. We're getting more and more anecdotal reports and, formal reporting as well of targeting with voice clones, with deepfakes. So that's probably my big concern in terms of the next wave of fraud and scam attacks, to be honest.
Might that also mean like before, when we were talking about the Trojan and the web injects and all those, the Dridex, the dire stuff that you talked about, was really consumer focused. And then, of course, once they perfect that, they move into commercial banking, because that's where the whales are, if you will. Do you foresee that happening in this space and impersonation as well? That it will move
100%.
to commercial
100%. Some of those big reports of what has happened already has been in the commercial banking space. So, there's that big incident that allegedly took place out of Hong Kong, where a company lost $25 million. So it's already in the commercial space because, you can impersonate an individual, but with a lot of this new technology, it makes it much easier to impersonate an organization as well. And if you're impersonating an organization and that organization is the bank, and you're targeting, commercial or corporate entities, then there are a lot of possibilities for fraudsters in that space. So, back to the kind of cyber fraud fusion model, I think a lot of this is being very well aware of how quickly this is moving and getting to a position where, an industry starts to do what isn't really traditionally done in the fraud space, which is proactively testing your fraud and AML controls in a way that we would do, in the cyberspace, for years, right? So I sometimes explain it by, if you describe something as a vulnerability versus describing it as a control gap, it gets treated completely differently.
Are you talking about red teaming your fraud controls?
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
100%. Yeah. Because, even with the best will in the world, a lot of the really, really forward-leaning fraud prevention technology providers, nobody can be 100% confident that their solutions are 100% secure against the latest threats that are out there. So I think, it's incumbent on organizations to try and add an extra layer of security on top of that by doing that level of proactive testing themselves.
That's amazing. So, Senan, we're at the end of this conversation. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you that I could be your guest. For Threat Fabric, this was Eward Driehuis. This was the latest episode of Fusion Fireside. My guest was Senan Moloney at Barclays. Check out more episodes at www.threatfabric.com/Fusion Fireside, and we'll see you at the next one.